Well, hello. Welcome to week 4 of the Intro to Christian Ethics with the Center for Ministry. I'm excited to get to be with you again for this 4th week. Well, this week we're turning our attention to ethical codes for ministers. And let's be real, for other workers in the church, we cannot be too careful with any of this. Now, we may wonder why we need to have ethical codes. I mean, come on, we're ministers, or we're studying to be ministers, or we work in the church. Well, let me give you at least a couple of examples from my own personal experience. Early on in ministry, I was a young Christian in my early 20s, maybe my mid-20s. I wasn't an official minister yet. I was working as a secretary at a church, the church where I'd made my profession of faith. And I found myself in a dilemma, in what I came to understand was an ethical dilemma. There was a very dear couple in the church. He was the chair of the Pastoral Relations Committee. She chaired the Christian Education Department. She's the one who taught me about Christian education, how to teach Sunday school, and she passed away. And after her husband had done some healing, a few weeks after her funeral, he began to come to the church every day while I was there in the office. Now, we were a small church. We had a part-time minister who was bivocational, and the minister wasn't there during the day when I was. And so the man would come. That's not too uncommon. He would come. His son would come at times. Different people would be there on a regular basis. And in many respects, remember, we're in inner city Atlanta, not the best of neighborhoods. We were still doing church at a time when you kept the doors unlocked. So again, wasn't uncommon for people to come in and out of the church to check on what was happening there in the office. Well, another piece of this is that the church was very huggy. I wasn't raised in a very huggy family, but learned about hugging and not how to hug, but hugging was something that they did. And so it wasn't uncommon for this chair of the Pastoral Relations Committee to come and to hug. And that's what you did. Someone came, you'd get up, you shook a hand, and if you knew them well, then you would hug. I don't know for how long it had gone on, but I did become aware at one time that hug had become sexualized, and that there are things that can happen and you don't really realize they're happening, and then at some point you say, I wonder how long this has been going on. And such was the case in this hugging. I say sexualized. He was becoming aroused by that, and quite honestly, I didn't know what to do about it. Relatively, let's say, new in the church, a young Christian. He's chair of the Pastoral Relations Committee. He has power and authority over me. If I was to say anything to my husband at that time, my husband, what he might do was not a very good thing. I needed the job, and so I didn't want to jeopardize my job in any way. I thought if I were to say something and he denied it, who would the church believe? And so I missed church a little bit. I felt like I couldn't even tell my minister about it. And finally, one day, I was able to say to him, I got up the courage. I had practiced for days and said, I'm just not comfortable hugging. And he stepped back and he said, oh, I understand. And he left shortly after that. He started coming back a couple weeks later, and he would just come in and pull up a chair. He was in his 70s. I can attribute and contribute it to many things, but it doesn't change the fact that it was inappropriate, unethical behavior. So from that personal place, let me tell you another one. There was a minister that I had occasion to work with when I was in a denominational office, and there was no secret amongst many that this minister, who had worked in youth ministry, had been inappropriate, had conducted himself inappropriately with a student. This minister wasn't ordained. He had had credentialing, shall we say, not ordination, but credentialing through the denomination. I did not know about this offense until I got a phone call. And the phone call came because he was getting married to the youth that he had had the inappropriate relationship with. And I called the person who had been his minister at the time when he was on staff at that church and asked about what had happened and how that had been adjudicated, if you will, how that had been addressed. And the minister said that the parents didn't want to bring charges against him, that he was married at the time, had children. They didn't want to do anything about that, and they didn't want to see him let go. He very charismatic, very talented person, and the agreement was made that he would not have any more relationship with the daughter. And so the call came to us because obviously there had been a relationship with the daughter, because now just maybe 3 or 4 years later he's getting married to her. So we went back and we tried to figure out all of these pieces and what to do with them, and realized there was nothing at that point that we could do, because also in the meantime he had left the church. So we had placed it back into the hands of the church. I talked to an older, wiser denominational person for advice, and that's what we were asked to do. Shortly thereafter, I was told that this minister was going to be preaching at a revival in another part of the state, and that there was belief that by preaching that revival at that church, there was a pastoral opening, and that people were concerned. The person who called me, was concerned that this minister might try to arrange becoming their new minister. And at that point, I had to call him. And I said, listen, I've been told a couple of conflicting things. The first is that you are an incredible minister, that you have so many gifts and so many skills for ministry, and that in ministry is really where you ought to be. I'm also told with that, though, that you had what we would call an ethical breach or a sexual indiscretion. And I am aware that you are going to preach a revival in a church in search of a minister. And what I need to say to you is, if any conversation comes around you're becoming their minister, you need to decline the invitation, or I'm going to have to call them and tell them about your ethical breach, your sexual indiscretion, and how it's never been addressed or taken care of. I followed that up, though, with, I understand, again, that you're so talented and gifted and appear to have a call, a big C call from God to be one of His ministers. And I would like to have conversation with you about that, to have a broader conversation about how we might right those wrongs, how we might ensure that an ethical breach of the nature that you had, how that might not happen again. And this minister came in, met with him from a denominational minister from the larger church, the wider church, the chair of our Commission on Ministry. And all I could say to him was, if I don't even know what this looks like, if you will, what these hoops look like, but I do know that there's work you're going to have to do to put you back into a place where we could credential you and recognize you as a minister once again. And that's going to start with a psych eval, so that we can get a sense, so that you can get a sense of what was going on. What was it in you that that would cause that kind of breach, that would allow that kind of breach, that would do that kind of breach. And from there, then I said we could work with that psychologist and with one another and with you to put together a prescription of sorts that would address whatever that was going on, whatever it is that caused you to respond the way you did, to act, to aggress, right? The way that you did. And with that prescription, then following that prescription, then looking at what kind of safeguards Schmitz calls those guardrails we would need to have in place to help prevent it from happening again. And then we would have you come and meet with the Commission on Ministry to talk about restoring or re-credentialing you. The minister, I say this, that minister wanted to know, how long will that take? Who knows? When we're talking about reconciliation here, who knows how long it takes? Who knows what the prescription's going to be? Who knows? And we asked people, we looked, we read, and we're trying to get a sense of what is long enough after there's an ethical breach. Definitely it depends on what the ethical breach was, circumstances, all of these other pieces. But how do you do that? And how do you know it's not going to happen again? How can you trust that it won't happen again? That's not just about liability or lawsuits, which is what our attorneys kept saying. You've got to be really careful about lawsuits. But beyond that, and for me, the most important aspect is that it's about people. It's about people. How do we protect people from the consequences of an ethical breach? How do we do that? And when someone's committed an egregious ethical break, how can we protect people from that ever happening again? Whether you like it or not, or you believe it or not, or you feel it or not, ministers and other leaders in the church have authority and varying amounts of power. Now, a lot of disempowered parishioners or wanting to be in power parishioners may try to make us feel like we have no authority. I was once challenged by, I've been actually a couple times challenged by want to be leaders in a church of my authority. What authority do you have to say that? I have been asked. So we do have authority there. We do have power, whether it's actually given to us or it is imbued in our position. So we really have to be careful because of that power. It's easy to wield that power. It's easy for other people to put themselves in positions where they feel like they're being wielded by our power. And power corrupts, right? Isn't there something that says power corrupts completely or absolutely? It really does. And it's easy for us to fall into that trap because being empowered, right? There's that thin line between being empowered, in power. I have found often in ethical breaches that it's those who feel disempowered, at least subconsciously, are feeling disempowered, that are more subconsciously, unconsciously going to act out power dynamics. There's also a thin line for us in ministry between the spiritual self and the sexual self. And when we get to working with people in spiritual relationships with prayer partners and the like, there's still so often a sexual dynamic to that. And maybe I shouldn't say so often. There can be, it's right there, a sexual part to that. So when you find yourself doing spiritual direction or prayer partnering in some sort with a person of the opposite sex, that can be a problem. Now, I've been asked by people who are in same-sex relationships if then having same-sex partners could be a problem. And honestly, I don't know the answer to that, but it makes sense to me that that would be the case because, again, it's the sexual part of ourselves and the spiritual part of ourselves that are very deeply entwined. It is no wonder to me that some of our greatest theologians have also had the most trouble with the ethics of relationships and sexual relationships at that. So even those of us with the best intentions that are really walking that spiritual line, even those of us are at risk at putting others in risk. My Bill and I have an agreement. Anytime we're going to lunch or dinner or a meeting where we'll be riding with someone in the same car that is, for me, a male, for him, a female, we call when we, before we leave, we both apprise one another of that meeting and the circumstances around it. You know, I'm going to be I'm going to lunch with Greg, who is one of my dearest friends. He's a mutual friend, but even before he was, I say a mutual friend of my Bill and me, even before that, Greg was very much a colleague and becoming a good friend. And so I would say to Bill, I'm going to have lunch with Greg, and I'm assuming that he's going to pick me up and he's going to drive. Or Mark Palmer, who is the CEO of Woodhaven, and when I have served on their board and I go to have lunch with him, and I say to my Bill, I'm going to have lunch with Mark today. I'm not sure which of us is going to be driving. I'll call you when we get back. And then as soon as I get back from those meetings, I call him to say, hey, I'm back. He does the same thing. We have for years and years and years had an agreement that we will never have, for me, a man, him, a woman to our home when the other is not home, or when there's, not a group of us together. We just are very open about those dynamics in our relationship. Now, I remember several years ago saying to him, you don't have anything to worry about. I would never have an affair. I would never cheat on you. And what he said was, when the moment you say wouldn't or you couldn't, you open yourself up to could. Because when we say I can't, I won't, I wouldn't, I couldn't, it's very possible for us to let our guard down. And when it comes to ethics, we always have to be, I've been saying this recently, conscious. We have to be on guard. We have to be vigilant because relationships are that important. Best intentions. There was a minister that served a church. I served quite a number of years before I was there. Great pastoral caregiver. Provided pastoral care to the wife of a parishioner who was dying. He went to the hospital nearly every day the last few weeks, months before that parishioner died, and got to know the wife very, 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 very well. And there were speculations that this minister was perhaps being inappropriate with the wife. People in their Sunday school class teased, men teased. The women weren't so enamored by the apparent relationship. The men would tease him, and I think in their own way were trying to say to him, hey, this isn't appropriate, even though they were, they felt themselves colleagues. They felt themselves on an even keel, on an even level with this minister. He was the minister. And those leaders in the church never thought it their place to challenge him on that relationship. Well, the relationship grew. In fact, that minister's marriage ended up ending about that. He swore he never had an affair, and there was absolutely nothing there with the man's wife. The man passed on. His marriage, the minister's marriage, was still quite broken. Did end, and a few years after that, the minister and the wife, not too many years later, the minister and the wife of the deceased got married. And all of those church leaders continued to wonder what really happened and had that look in their eye that they had no doubts. Soon after that, there was a boundaries training. It was one of the first boundaries training in that particular region. And that minister was there, and the leader of the ethics or the boundaries course walked through all of these steps and about appropriate relationships, appropriate boundaries, what to watch out for, and the like. And I was so close to the minister when I heard him say, why didn't anyone ever tell us that before? Why is it that I have been in ministry nearly 40 years and I'm just hearing about this for the first time? And I thought, oh my gosh, isn't that common sense? Isn't that the decency of relationships? Aren't you supposed to respect another man's wife, another person's spouse? But somehow or another, it appears that that message did not get to him, or something happened that in that moment he couldn't see another side. And that's what happens so often. So how do we keep ourselves in check? I want you to pay particular attention to Schmidt's chart of distorted strengths that's in chapter 7. If you're working with the print book, it's on page 122. But she's got this chart, and let's pick it up. It says traits that become distorted by power, has strength. It talks about when that strength is distorted, what it becomes. I want you to look at that and look at it closely. Take some notes, maybe in your book or in that place where you keep notes that you want to refer to later on. Evernote is a good one. Call it ethics. Tab it, label it ethics. Look at Schmidt's suggestions for keeping yourself safe. Let me say to you as well, unless you have a counseling degree, you're licensed, and you have that person that you are accountable to, refer. Ministers do not have enough time to do counseling. You may think you're trained, you may have some classes or courses, but you do not have time to do counseling, and the boundaries involved are too mushy and too rife for breaking. Refer. Ask other ministers in your town. Go see the school counselor. Who do they refer people to? Refer. Boundaries training. If you're in a denomination, most of our denominations now require boundaries training. Don't make excuses. Get there. If you have to do it every 2 years, every 3 years, every 5 years, don't complain. Go. They've taught the same thing last year, 5 years ago, 3 years ago. Go. I've been going to boundary training since 1995. Every 2 to now 5 years, I am at a boundary trainings. Actually, my last one was 2 or 3 years. I'm due another boundary training, and you know what? It's probably going to be about the same one that I've had over and over and over again. In fact, I've been trained as a boundaries facilitator, but you know what? I'm going to take it because it's that opportunity to be there and to be reminded and to keep it fresh in my head. Self-care, we're going to be picking up on that in not too many weeks from now. How we take care of ourselves. We have to take care of ourselves to keep our boundaries in check. You've got to guard your relationships, the work on your relationships, and you've got to have those accountability partners. Again, more of that to come. Remember, God is first, our relationship with God. Your relationship with yourself is second, then your relationship with your family and close relationships. Those do not include your parishioners. Parishioners cannot be your family. Your parishioners cannot be your accountability partners. They cannot be your close relations. When you leave your congregation, you leave your relationships with those parishioners. They are parishioners. God, you, family and close friends, and then parishioners, those that you serve with. One of the biggest boundary fractures that we make, and I see this so often over and over and over again. And if you're in this situation, I know you're going to argue with me about it, but there's no argument. We get too close to our parishioners. And we lose our ability to be their minister. And if you're not their minister, if you're not their pastor, then who is? And when you leave, you have to take your ministering and your pastoring away with you. And where does that leave them? And without them in your life, where does that leave you? I've given you 6 different denominations, ethical codes. There are congregational codes as well this time round, or what we're doing here is talking, though, about the clergy ethical codes. Do know, at least in the Christian Church, Disciples of Christ, we do have congregational codes, and it would be a good thing to familiarize yourself with that. Also know, though, that churches don't tend to like talking about congregational codes because, you know, all congregations are ethical, and often when we suggest them, it's because they're not being ethical, they are not acting ethically, and that just opens up a bigger can of worms. So be gentle around those. Don't do those without talking to your denominational minister first. Ethical codes, covenants of conduct. At my ordination, Reverend Dr. David Alexander, who was our regional minister, at the end of the service, handed me my certificate of ordination that would soon be signed by him, my pastor, and by different ministers and elders that were in attendance. But he also handed me the Disciples of Christ Code of Conduct. And he said, Chris, I want you to sign this and hang it next to your certificate of ordination. And still today, over 2 decades later, wherever my ordination certificate hangs, right next to it, you'll find my covenant of conduct. It's got my signature at the bottom. It's got my regional minister's signature next to mine, or maybe mine is next to his. And it hangs there. And I keep T underneath it so that on a regular basis, I have to go over there, and it's right there. I hang it eye level. And I try to read through it. I try to be conscious enough to read through it. Dave's long since retired, but I hope that I will follow those principles laid out in it long after I retire. If you are in the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, if you're working towards ordination, you're working towards commissioning perhaps, I want you to think about that covenant of conduct and making sure that you've signed it and you hang it next to your certificate. Some parts of these covenants are not easy for disciples. It says that when we leave a ministry, when we leave a location of ministry, a church, that we will no longer have contact with our former congregation for at least a year after the new minister arrives. Now, that's not after the interim minister arrives. That's after the new minister arrives, which means it could be 3 years before the new minister arrives, and it's going to still be another year. That's 4 years. And you don't just pop in, or you don't just walk up to the minister and hey, I'd like to come back. You have to go talk to your regional minister for permission to come back, so that you don't put that minister into a hard spot between, what is it called, a rock and a hard place. You don't talk to the leaders of the church and say, I'd really like to come back. You have to go talk to that regional minister, and he or she will check on whether or not it's the time or it's good for you to come back. Your next paper, your first paper, is your own personal covenant of conduct, your own code of ethics. If you're a member of a denomination, you want to make sure that your covenant of conduct is in line with your denomination's covenant of conduct, with your denomination's code of ethics, or code of conduct, code of behavior. So I'm not asking you to rewrite or to place your denomination's covenant or code into yours. I'm asking you to keep it in mind, as well as keeping the other denominations' ideas in mind as you move along. So I want you to draw on your and other denominations' covenants for ideas, but also draw on our readings from this week. There's that one, developing an ethical code of ethics. There's another one, is some ethical principles that comes from a business perspective. And remember, we're talking about the church. That's God's business. Look and see what might be helpful for you, what would be would be some good ideas to incorporate or to adapt into your own personal covenant of conduct. That's going to be due in another week, so you want to start working on that and thinking into that. Now, there are a lot of pieces in our denominational code of ethics, so what I want you to do is write something that's going to be easy for you to remember. It's easy and it's memorable. Maybe it's like an acrostic, or something that an acronym that spells out a word. Maybe it spells out your name. Maybe it spells out Jesus. I don't know. Be creative. Use bullet points. Write the word and then a sentence to explain what you're trying to say. I do want to see explanation. I don't want to see just words, but not a paragraph of explanation. Easy, memorable. How long? I don't know. Try not to go over a page. I wouldn't put too many bullet points. I think even 20 bullet points is going to be too much for you to remember. Make it 1 page, 1-inch margins. You're going to Arial 10 or Times New Roman 12 is your font size. I know our paper guidelines say single space. I'd suggest that you do 1.5 or double space on these, so that they're set apart and you can see them more easily. Again, this week, I want to say to you, have some fun. I think you've been doing it. Wow, you guys, you blow me away by the ways, your intention, your integrity, your depth in answering the questions that we're putting out there, and the questions of your classmates. You're amazing. You really, really are amazing. And I think you're having some fun. I hope you're having some fun. So I do want you to have some fun this week. But before we jump in, I want you to stop for a moment. We're going to stop for a moment. And here's the question I want you to ask yourself. What is one nice thing I can do for myself this week? Do you hear that question? What one nice thing could I do for myself this week? Only for myself. What's one nice thing I could do for myself? Be selfish. Do you have that question in mind? What's one nice thing I could do for myself this week? I'm going to pause here for a second, and I want you to think on that question. Here it is. You ready? What is one nice thing that you can do for yourself this week? What is one nice thing you can do for yourself this week? Answer that question. How did you answer that question? What is it? What is this one nice thing that you can do for yourself this week? This isn't an, oh, I'd like to. It's a real question. Because the next question I have for you is, when are you going to do it? Are you going to do it Tuesday evening, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, next Monday? When are you going to do it? Be specific. I want you to put it on your calendar. So here's your first piece of work for this week. Up on the discussion forum, I want you to write the answer to these two questions. All you do up there is put 1, period. And you write that one nice thing you're going to do for yourself this week. And underneath that, 2, write when you're going to do it. Right? 1, tell each other, tell us, we're going to tell one another what nice thing we're going to do for ourselves this week. And then 2, write down when you're going to do it. Got it? I'll see you on the forum. Have fun with it and enjoy your special treat to you. Have a great week.